Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hello, and welcome to a special Between Takes episode of Missing Frames. I'm your host, Shawn Eastridge. I am so excited today to share this conversation I had with author Melissa Maerz about her new book, All Right, The Oral History of Richard Linklater's Dazed and Confused. And if you're asking yourself, did I have to struggle not to go into a Matthew McConaughey impersonation right there? Yes, I did. And we talk a little bit about that in this interview. So just to give you a little bit of background on Melissa, she is a writer and an editor who's contributed to Spin, Rolling Stone, and Entertainment Weekly, amongst other publications. And she was also a founding editor at New York Magazine's Vulture website. So I just finished reading this oral history a couple of weeks ago, and I absolutely loved it. Like, I mean, I'm biased. I'm a huge Linklater fan, as many of you know, but it doesn't matter. I mean, if you're a fan of Dazed and Confused or Linklater or just film in general, you have to check this book out. It's such a great story, and Melissa got so many amazing interviews with people like Matthew McConaughey, Jason London, Ben Affleck, even the film's crew members and like peripheral people, like extras and people who are kind of just circling the film's orbit. Like Jason Lee has a connection to this film that I had no idea about. So Melissa and I discussed how this project got started, how initially Linklater was kind of reluctant to be involved because he's talked so much about Dazed and Confused, and he himself describes the film as middling and doesn't really understand why people love it so much. So he was kind of like, I don't know if I want to talk about it. But then he did eventually relent. She even reached out to some of his high school classmates to confirm that many of the things that happen in the film were actually pulled from real life, like the hazing scenes. That really happened. We also talk about how this project ended up being even more like a Linklater product than the film itself, and the way it kind of examines the passage of time and nostalgia. So Melissa, she was just awesome. I had a great time. I hope you have a great time listening. Enjoy.
Now available to own on video cassette.
Okay, so Melissa, this is perhaps the most important question I will ask during this interview. How much do you struggle not to do a McConaughey impression when you say the title of this book? Because I've told people how amazing this book is. I'm like, you've got to read this book. All right. And you can hear it even right now. I just start to dip into McConaughey. So how hard is it for you personally?
I just try and say it super fast so that I don't have to think about it, because I have the worst impressions of anyone ever. So I just kind of mumble, all right. And I just hope that nobody,
you're like, it's an oral history of Dazed and Confused. What's it called? So.
But
good.
people who have interviewed me, I've heard some really amazing McConaughey impressions. So I will leave that to folks like yourself. I can't
I'm starting to think this was the plan all along, just to make people do that, so you could kind of have a laugh at their expense. All right, I see what's going on here. How did you get introduced to Dazed and Confused? Do you remember the first time you saw it, and just did you love it immediately? Did it take a little bit of time before you really connected with it?
So I saw it in the theater, and I was the same age as Mitch, I think, in the movie in 1993. And it kind of blew my mind at the time. I mean, it still kind of feels pretty different than what I was used to growing up in terms of teen movies. Like, I think I was so used to this idea of the 80s teen movie, the John Hughes teen movie, where things were pretty dramatic. Somebody was always in a major fight with somebody, or there was like a car crash, or there's some crazy party at some rich kid's mansion, or, things were really kind of dramatic. And Dazed and Confused was just the opposite of that. It kind of, the whole movie is just basically, kids in high school waiting for something to happen. And now I think of that as being very true to my high school experience. But I think when I was going into this in 1993, it just seemed like high school is going to be the coolest thing ever. Like, even though it took place in the 70s, it felt like the future to me. It felt like, oh, there's going to be drinking, there's going to be driving around, there's going to be, older kids. Like, it just felt really exciting. And now it just feels like, oh yeah, we spent a lot of time being bored.
Yeah. That's what's when I first saw Dazed and Confused, I was in college, and I remember thinking, I was like, was I hanging out with the wrong people in high school? Because all these kids are so much cooler than I was and still am to this day. But which group do you think you would have fit in with the most?
Yeah, well, I think another thing that's so revolutionary about Dazed is that there aren't clear posses
Yeah.
necessarily like there are in other teen movies. Like you look at John Hughes and there's always like, the nerd and the jock and the popular girl. And here, all of those things kind of blend. Like you look at Pink, who's the main character, and he's not just the jock. He's also like on the newspaper. He plays poker with, the other guys. He smokes weed. He's a stoner who's also a jock, which I don't remember having seen in a movie before that.
Yeah.
But if I had to pick somebody, I think I'm probably closest to Tony, who's Anthony Rapp's character in that movie. I think I was kind of nerdy, maybe at the party, but not cool enough to be there, that kind of thing. How about you? Who do you think?
I was gonna say Anthony Rapp.
Yeah.
Totally Anthony Rapp. Not even as cool as Anthony Rapp. Like I was somewhere between, like I was very Wiley Wiggins pretty much through high school, but even without the benefit of being able to play a sport.
Yeah.
And I guess it's more who would I have been hanging out with, and it's definitely him and Marissa. Is it Marissa? Marissa and Adam. That's the group. I think not even being on their level, but just wanting to be in the car with them and hearing those conversations. There was a great line in the book that I never thought about, but I can't remember who said it. They basically mentioned all their scenes feel like the proto Linklater characters. Like you can totally see the seeds of Before Sunrise in their scenes together. Whereas everyone else is very like, yeah, let's go to the party, let's do this. But most of like those just those kind of shooting the shit philosophy scenes kind of come from those car scenes. So I always, as a kid growing up, I was like, yes, please, I want to listen to all the ideas and things like that. It's a long way of saying that's who I would have been hanging out with.
Well, what's interesting about those characters is I feel like Linklater kind of makes jokes sometimes that some characters in certain movies grow up to be characters in other movies. Like there is some kind of like interconnected Linklater universe. Obviously, I don't think he's doing that literally. I think it's because a lot of those characters are based on him and have a lot of autobiographical details to them. But I look at those characters in the car, and I think somebody said in the book too, that you see like the seeds of Slacker, even though Slacker came out before that. You think that these guys in the 70s who are in the car talking about politics and conspiracy theories and all this might grow up to go to Austin, move from whatever small town it's supposed to be in Dazed in Texas to Austin and become some of the characters in Slacker. Like there's definitely kind of a through line in his movies of the types of characters who grow up to be other characters in other films.
I mean, if you are pitching right now a Linklater cinematic universe, I am here for it. I'm there.
I had originally thought about writing a chapter about it, and then I was like, oh no, people are going to take this way too literally, and I can't do it.
Well, how does something like this get started? Like, first of all, obviously you grew up loving the film, and this is clearly a passion project for you, but I imagine the challenge is Dazed and Confused is something that I was just watching interviews on the Criterion box set, was just so awesome. But you get this feeling of like, you would think all this material had been mined, and somehow you managed to get these gems of stories that I'd never heard before, that like some were familiar, but there were other things that were really, really amazing. But like for you, what were the challenges starting off? Because I know there was some talk when you were trying to convince Linklater to do it, and he was kind of like, I've talked about that, I'm good, I'm done. But like, how did you pitch it? Like, what did you say to really be like, no, I think I can come at this with a fresh angle? And then was it a matter of once you got Linklater involved, everyone else kind of fell into place, or how did that work exactly?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you're absolutely right. I think I originally wrote to him before I wrote the book proposal because I knew I needed to get him on board at least for one interview, right? And he wrote me back. So I kind of gave him a pitch, and he wrote me back, and he was like, exactly what you said. He said, I'm kind of sick of talking about Dazed. I don't think it's my best movie. I think he said, I think it's middling is at best, which surprised me. And but then toward the end of the email, he was kind of like, but have you seen this behind the scenes footage? And have you read this thing that I wrote about it? And he was kind of pointing me towards sources. So he agreed to do one interview. And there was a big part of me that was scared that that was all I was going to get. But I think the more I talked to him, the more he was open to talking and the more he started to trust me, and it kind of went from there. But really, I think the only person he helped actively get for me was Matthew McConaughey, who had his own book coming out. So I'm very lucky that Linklater, told him
That's
that I was
right.
an okay person to talk to. But everybody else, I think, did it because they have such fond memories of that movie. I think that's the main reason why they agreed.
Well, a lot of what this book does that I think is brilliant and why I think it is a worthwhile addition. And this oral history feels like the Dazed and Confused sequel in a way that Before Sunset is to Before Sunrise. Whereas Sunset kind of feels like, oh, now 9 years later, what are these characters doing now? It isn't as peachy keen as it was when they were young and idealized 20-year-olds in love. There's a lot of that in this document. So it almost feels like an essential companion. And there is a sense when I was reading it of we're hearing a lot of the stuff. Like I think Jason London's story in particular is where it really struck me. And my heart goes out to him. I love him so much. And just reading his story and hearing about how this was like, so for so many of us, there are certain moments in our lives where we just feel like, man, I wish that was the last time I really felt these things, or I could really get to that innocent mindset or that really joyful mindset. And for Jason, the filming of Dazed and Confused really, really represents that beyond just like the experience that everybody else had, because he had to face the death of his sister not long after the production wrapped. And then kind of based on what he said, just kind of went into the spiral. So there is this sense of like, this book kind of fulfills that Linklater vibe of here's what happened after, and here's how like life works, and how like this moment in time is only contained to this.
Yes.
How do you like, I mean, was that something you started to realize? Was it intentional from the beginning, or did you start to realize as you were compiling all these interviews together, like you were like, oh, there is like that kind of bittersweet feeling of people looking back on this as if it is that kind of thing?
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's funny. A funny thing happened to me recently. People used to ask me where the idea came from, or like where the point of interest came from that I wanted to actually write a whole book about this. And I used to give this answer. I used to say, which I really thought was true, that it came from a point where I read an interview with Richard Linklater where he said that he wanted Dazed and Confused to be an anti-nostalgia movie. And I thought, wow, I wonder how, this anti-nostalgia movie became the ultimate nostalgia movie for so many people. Like I know people who watch it over and over again because they miss high school. I know people who watch it because they miss the 70s. Now people watch it because they miss the 90s. The cast misses the 90s so much, which I think is a big part of this book. So I think my original idea was like, let's talk about nostalgia as a concept in Linklater's work, and also in the creation of this film and why people connect to it. That was my original idea. What I did not foresee coming, which now seems like a really dumb thing on my part that I didn't see coming, was that the book itself would become such a collection of nostalgia. I thought I would be analyzing and kind of pushing back against the idea of nostalgia.
Well, how funny is it that that's exactly what Linklater thought when he was making Dazed and Confused, and you experienced the same thing?
I experienced the same thing. And then another layer on this is that just last week, I have a friend who's writing a book, and he asked me to send him the proposal. And I hadn't looked at this proposal for ages. And I sent it back to him, and I thought, there is nothing in here about nostalgia. Like, I really thought that was my original reason for writing this book. And now I think even me thinking that nostalgia was the original reason for writing this book is a bit of nostalgia. Like I kind of reordered what my memory is to fit, I think, what this book has become. And you see that happening in this book, where I'm interviewing people about things that happened in the past, and there's conflicting memories, and people really want to make the experience of making Dazed into something that it might not have been, or it might have been, but I think is also just kind of created by nostalgia. So there's all these levels of reflection of like, what happened to me happened to Linklater, what happened to these people and who were making this movie is also what the movie's about. Like there's just all these levels of nostalgia.
Well, you should be very proud of yourself, because the fact that this can feel like part of that story, and not only that, but enrich the story, that's a pretty incredible accomplishment. Were there any, as far as stories that you didn't know about. There were things that I loved as far as, and again, I'm so glad you were able to get more interviews with Linklater, because he reveals a side of himself that you don't get a lot of, because he's such a laid back guy. But
Yeah.
this film essentially was it was his first studio film. And it
Yeah.
is the classic, like David and Goliath cliche story of what happens when kind of the indie filmmaker, the hot new guy in town, like, let's snatch him up and give him $6 million to make our bigger, quote unquote, budget movie. And literally every single door slamming in his face, or every single argument, confrontation, every single obstacle that could come up in his way to prevent him from getting the vision he wanted. There is that story in there. And that was something I kind of knew about, but it wasn't as prevalent as in this document, and particularly just the stories of between him and Jim Jacks. Was there anything
Yeah.
in there that really surprised you, where you were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that even happened?
Well, I was really surprised. I think somebody had told me that there was a rumor that Linklater had threatened to go up to the office of Tom Pollock, who ran Universal at the time, with a razor, and threatened to cut himself over these,
Yeah.
over these problems he was having with the studio. And I thought, there's no way that's true. But I brought it to him. I was like, I've heard this story, and he was like, oh yeah, that's true. And like you said, Linklater is such a laid back guy. It's really hard for me to reconcile the guy that I talk to now with the person he was back then. And I think that's part of the reason, I included a lot of excerpts from his diary from 1992, 1993 in the book. And I did that in part because he sounds really angry. Like
Yeah.
the voice of that is really angry. And that's just not someone I think of, that voice, when I think
I
of Richard.
mean,
Yeah.
his letter to Robert Plant is
Yeah.
one of the funniest things, but also one of the, like, I just feel like, man, when I was in my 20s, or when something like, it was like, I'm never talking to that guy again. Like, it's just like that vibe of like, I hate you so much. And then the fact that he had to go back to ask for a song for School of Rock years later is just perfect. But I had no idea.
Yeah. Well, and the fact that, it's so amazing to me. Like you think of something like what happened between Slacker and Dazed, that he, like you were saying, he made this $23,000 movie on credit cards, and then was, went to the studio for this $6 million movie. Like that just doesn't happen today. Like the version today, I think, of that happening is somebody making an indie movie that gets snapped up to make a Marvel movie. You
Yes.
don't get to make that mid-tier $6 million movie anymore. So I think it's really interesting that, like, you'd think of somebody today might feel like they're mad at the studio for the compromises they make, but they wouldn't make that public. And
Mhm.
Linklater, on his first studio film, aired all of his grievances in the Austin Chronicle and didn't really care what the repercussions would be. And, I think he's kind of embarrassed about the tone of
Mhm.
those rants. But in some ways, I admire that he was really steadfast about the choices that he wanted to make for this film. And even though he fought constantly with the studio, as I chronicle in the book, the version of Dazed and Confused that we see now is really the version that he wanted. Like, there's nothing in that movie now that he didn't want there.
I also love that he kept in touch with the cast. Like, every time there was a setback, he would write them a letter and just be like, well, they don't get it. Like, I wanted to do the
Yeah.
yearbook photos for the poster, but they want to do the stupid smiley face for the poster instead. And you know what? Someday people are going to appreciate what we did here. But until that, I understand the embarrassment, but I do appreciate that there is a document, because a lot of times, filmmakers will feel like, oh, I must have done something wrong, or
Yeah.
I'm the indie guy. These guys make millions of dollars. They know what they're doing. So I love that he kind of was like, if I'm burning bridges, I'm going all out. I also love
Yeah.
just the general high school. I mean, this feels like it was high school and college. A lot of these kids this was essentially their high school college experience, and they were young kids. And it's insane how many actors that are in this film just went on to become so huge. But what were some of your favorite stories from the set of just like some of the, like the Parker Posey stuff, and
Yeah.
like Parker and Joey, like they're just kind of almost like very petty rivalry with Michelle and like things like that. Were there any stories in particular that you were like, oh, this is something I need to get every single angle on? Like, you were just determined to find out all the details about particular like drama on set and these interplays or romances and things like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the romances I just think are really sweet. Like, you always hear about people hook up on film sets. It happens all the time. It's no surprise. But there was just something really kind of innocent. I mean, Wiley Wiggins had his first kiss while he was, working on that movie. Like, there's just kind of a sweetness to it. But the kind of the personal dramas among the actors in the movie. At first, I wrestled with whether or not I should put that in there because I thought, is that really part of the story of the making of this movie? But ultimately, it really does feel like high school. Like I think that Michelle Burke Thomas really felt like Joey Lauren Adams and Parker Posey were mean to her, were mean girls to her. I think that Parker Posey and Joey Lauren Adams don't see it that way at all. But that's high school, right? It's like the people who, like, I can remember girls who I thought like, oh, she was so mean to me. And I'm sure if you ask them about me now, they'd be like, who? Like that's the way it goes. And I think that really shows like sometimes the way that your experience is in high school really shapes certain parts of you forever, in the same way that the way you are in a work situation in your 20s when you have your first big job kind of shapes the way that you are and the role you play in your career. So I think that's why I ended up including that stuff in there, is because there, again, these layers of reflection of a movie about high school where there were high school dynamics behind the scenes that really did kind of end up playing out in Hollywood, and Hollywood being high school in similar ways.
And the Shawn and Mia stuff as well comes to mind. Is just like, and it's so unfortunate that they are just clearly the experience is something they're like, we'd rather not talk about. But
Yes.
to hear it from everybody else, and I love when you have these great, like, I mean, because very clearly, like Jason and Rory, like nobody liked Shawn. I feel like, and based on what I've read, I can't blame them. Usually people who share my name and spell their name the same way as I do, I tend to like sympathize with them, but not in this case. But I do love that between the between just these rants of like, I hate that guy so much, you have Rick being like, poor Shawn, he was just in his own movie. Like, just like these really, how do you like that drama is all hysterical, but how do you, like, as you're writing and sequencing this stuff, like, what do you just find the ebb and flow of how to fit these little moments in, and like, do you like say, all right, well, we got enough of like people bashing him, let's fit in this little sympathetic line of like the other side of the conversation?
Yeah, well, usually when that happens in the book, I mean, this is why I love oral histories, because there's no pressure to have, to get all the information and say, this was the narrative, even though you weren't there. I like being able to have these conflicting memories that don't have to fit into a single idea of how things were. And so you see this happening throughout the book where people are like, oh, that guy smoked way more weed than I did. And then you talk to that person, and they're like, no, she smoked way more weed than I did. But this is the one chapter where everybody agrees. Everybody is saying the exact same thing about Shawn. And I kind of like also that the oral history format mirrors the voice of Linklater's films. They are very dialogue driven. That's the best thing about them. They are not kind of like writerly quotes in the movie in the way that it's not like, a David Mamet film or like a Woody Allen film. And I think that's one of the great things about Linklater is he has a very natural ear for the way that conversations play out in real life. So I was hoping that by doing an oral history that it would kind of capture some of that voice. But I did want to be able to at least leave that one chapter for everybody kind of ragging on Shawn, because whenever I did an interview with anybody, without me even asking about Shawn, somebody'd be like, so you heard about Shawn, right? I mean, like, it's obviously something that's like the one thing that everybody agrees on with this film.
Do you have any other like favorite story, not necessarily related to Shawn and Mia, but like, do you have any other favorite stories that somebody told you where you're like, oh, that's awesome?
I mean, I'm actually really moved by the chapter in the book where everybody talks about what their friendships were like after the movie. That I think for a little while, everybody thought that they'd move back to LA or New York or wherever they were, mostly LA, and still kind of ride this vibe, this kind of great behind the scenes party vibe that they had in the film. And hearing about, the relationships that, or the hardships people feel that they went through, or like, the still kind of like the gripes that they have with each other, also just feels so real to me. They go to this high school reunion, I'm going to call it. No, they go to the Dazed and Confused reunion 10 years later, which feels like a high school reunion to a lot of them. And, Jason London cried in his hotel room after that because he felt like he wasn't part of that group anymore. And to me, that feels so honest and so relatable, right? When you see the people you live through this great thing with and you can't really recreate it anymore, and it's sad.
Yeah,
So I think those were a lot of the stories that I loved.
that's the stuff I connected to a lot too. And like I said, it feels that the production of this film and this story in particular feels more Linklater-esque to me than even the movie. Like I said, I mentioned Jason, but you're right. Like just that stuff about him going back and just feeling like I'm not that person anymore. And it's so hard. And we've all done that. I mean, we've all maybe like looking at an old video or like, thanks to social media, you, depending on how long you've been using it, you have like an actual visual document of your life going through. So now people kind of live in this nostalgia haze in a way, and you can always go back to that and always feel this kind of sense of like, oh, things are never quite as good as they used to be. But the other, I mean, part of, I think, Linklater's philosophy is just like, you can't dwell in that, like you have to accept it. And what's nice is to see everybody kind of the success stories coming out of it, because you see so many people who were able to use this as a springboard, but then even people who didn't necessarily go on to have careers in acting, like Wiley, like he's just kind of like, no, it was great though. It was great. Like, it's not like the sense of like regret. It's a sense of it happened. It was amazing, but also you've got to keep living, LIVIN type deal.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's interesting is people always ask me, isn't it sad that some people didn't make it? And I think for the people who are sad that they didn't make it, it's sad. But I think there's lots of people in that movie who were just like, acting is not for me, and ended up doing amazing things in other parts of their lives. Like you said, like Wiley, who's at UCLA now, studying design, or Kristen Hinojosa, who plays Sabrina, the freshman girl in that movie, who's now an activist. Like there's certain people who are like, that was a great time, but I didn't need to do that forever. So I think, it's only sad if you think it's sad.
Did you, at what point did you realize you had to actually go back and start to interview not all of them, but the high school friends?
Oh, well,
because that was another, I loved hearing the like, oh no, that really happened. That thing you thought was ridiculous. Because I remember seeing the hazing scenes and being like, this feels a little, I don't know how, this is weird and uncomfortable, but also like, this couldn't have happened. It was like, no, it really happened. And then hearing the stories about like people who actually were upset at him for putting it in the movie and saying like, yeah, that wasn't funny. That was like very traumatizing. But like, at what point did you start to realize, oh, I should maybe, did you know from the start you wanted to talk to high school? Or was it like you got one interview with one of his high school buddies and then you were like, I should look into this a little more because this is kind of a gold mine?
Yeah, so I think it started because I think Rick had told me that the coach was inspired by a real coach that he had, and the coach that he had has passed away. Coach Clements is his real name, but I found his sons and talked to his sons, and one of his sons, a guy named Jay Clements, told me that Tony in the movie, when he tells the dream about the sexy Abraham Lincoln dream, he's like, that's Tony Olm. That was a real dream by a guy we went to high school with. And I was like, no way. Like, you put a real sex dream from your friends in this movie? So that felt really specific to me. So then I called Tony Olm and he told me he's like, this thing is real. And so I think every time I talked to somebody who grew up with Rick in Huntsville, I would ask them, who's the next person I should talk to? And I talked to probably way more people than I needed to. I could have gone down that rabbit hole forever, but I think a lot of directors say, our films are loosely autobiographical, or like all the characters are me. And I think a lot, Rick will say those things too. But I think he's also one of the few filmmakers who is very honest about how specific the details are from his high school experience. I mean, not just the paddling with the wooden paddles, which I was shocked to realize that not only the kids did, but also the teachers did until like a couple of years ago in Texas. Like, it was still legal for teachers to hit kids.
I also love the comment of like, oh yeah, it's so homoerotic, right? And Just the
Yes.
like, oh yeah, I guess it is. I never thought of that.
Yes. Well, I think you don't think of things from an outside perspective when you're going through it. Like one of the women who went to high school with Rick was telling me that she just thought everybody had these things where the kids would haze the other kids and parents would come out and applaud them and cheer them on. She was like, they don't do that in other places. I mean, she went to college in another place and they were like, no, nobody does that here. So to me, that was one. I mean, there are stories that have been told about Days before, but to me, I was like, I have never read this before. The real stories of the people who were involved in this, besides the people who ended up suing Linklater. But just hearing about, I mean, think about what if somebody made a movie about your high school experience using names of your high school friends and things you specifically remembered from high school? I mean, how would you feel about that? I think
That's
it's a
true.
really interesting thing to think about.
You on the one hand, you could be flattered, but on the other hand, depending if somebody's describing your Abraham Lincoln sex dream, not so much. Not so
Well, and I
much.
think people were upset that the things that they saw as traumatic, like being hazed, that people in movie theaters were laughing at that. And I think that really upset some people. So it's just interesting to hear their memories.
There's also a parallel, like bringing it back to Slacker. Like there is this. I love the details you include about the transition from Slacker to Dazed and Confused, and the crew members that came with them, and those that kind of got left behind. Not intentionally or maliciously, but just by the sheer fact that it was like, oh, this is a Richard Linklater film, and therefore he's the guy who's going to be doing all these things. In a way, there's almost this kind of like, well, how dare he, like, who does he think he is? And that's mirrored in the way I think part of the reason these high school classmates got like so worked up about it is partially because it's like, hey, that's, who do you think you are to take my story and
Yes.
do that? But also in the same way, these crew members feeling like, well, hey, it was our movie too, and why did you get to run off with all the glory? There are interesting parallels there.
Yes. Well, and I think one of the things that makes him such a successful filmmaker is that he has this background in athletics, that he's used to being a team player. He understands how to motivate people as a team, even though it's really, the coach's success that matters. And there aren't a lot of filmmakers who come from a team sports background, or at least not filmmakers that, I've really followed as that as an influence in their directing. So I think when you come from this team sports mentality, people start to really believe that they're the ones making this thing with you.
Yeah.
And it's true in some extent. Everybody's borrowing ideas from people when you're making a film, but in other ways, this is really Richard Linklater's vision, and it's a vision that no one else could have made in the same way that he did. So I think he's very smart. He makes things feel like a collaboration, even when they might not really be.
And what do you think? This feels like the question everybody asks, but it is so funny in the context of knowing that Linklater himself is very much like, I mean, everyone who made the movie seemed to enjoy the process. Not the executives at Universal and not him, but everybody, the cast and crew were like, yeah, this is pretty great. But he himself is like, it was great for them. Also, the movie's okay. What is it? What is it about Dazed and Confused? Like, what is it that makes people continue to latch onto it? Why do people continue to watch it and continue to hold it up in such high regard when even the filmmaker himself is like, there are other things I've done if you want to check those things out that I think might be better?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the answer is the same answer that you give about, why did people from his high school sue him? It's because everybody sees their own specific story in the movie. You talk to Andy Slater. There's a character named Slater, obviously, in the movie, but there's a real life Andy Slater who grew up with Richard Linklater. And he insists that some of the stuff about, the conspiracy theories about the dollar bill and stuff like that came from real conversations he had. But I also know friends from my high school who said that they had that same conversation about George Washington and weed when they were in high school before Dazed came out. So I think the reason why everybody, or not everybody, but the people who love Dazed love it is because they see it's like, that's my high school experience. It feels intensely personal to people. People will say, oh, we had a moon tower, but it wasn't called the moon tower. It was called the lagoon. Or like, we listened to Southern rock, or like we drove around to Aerosmith. Aerosmith was big again in the 90s when this came out. Like people have very specific details that I think they see in the film. And I think that's why it has become, the more specific it gets, the more universal it gets.
And for you, I mean, this is your first book, right?
Yeah, my first book. Yeah.
That's really exciting. So what are the big things you learned from this whole experience?
Oh my gosh.
Is that a loaded question?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that I really respect and has been kind of transformative for me is hearing how Richard Linklater really has never done a project that wasn't personal for him. I mean, obviously, there have been films that are, broader in scope or, will reach a bigger audience. But I mean, he's still making, films that are taking 12 years to make and, with the same small crew in Austin. And he's kind of an experimental guy. So I feel like that has inspired me personally to not think so much about who the audience is for what you're writing, but just to kind of go with something that obviously you really care about and the audience will be there. I mean, I had no idea that there would still be so many people who care as much about Dazed as I do. But it's a good thing there are.
Definitely. And what are you going to be working on next? What's the next plan? If you're allowed to talk about next projects. Are you just kind of like, there is, I mean, when you finish something as like epic in scope and as time consuming, I'm sure there's this sense of like, let me just ride the wave and like enjoy this for a little bit before I start thinking about the next project. But are you thinking about like what you want to do next?
Oh yeah, I mean, like I started right after I finished this book, but I think that's why I feel like Linklater has inspired me. The next book that I'm writing is fiction. It might be a disaster, who knows? It might make me $0. And I have a nonfiction book that I want to write after that. That's more about the music world. But I think I've just kind of got to do this thing that I want to do next. There's not too much to say about it yet because it's still kind of taking form in my head. But yeah, I credit him with that.
Well, that's really exciting. And I love that this project ended up inspiring your next project. And yeah. I thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I love this book so much. I think it's a really, really great, as I said, a great companion piece to the movie, which is an accomplishment because if something like this can stand on that level, I think you did a pretty good job. I think you should pat yourself on the back. Melissa, thank you.
Well, you asked such good questions. It was really nice to be on here with you. Thank you so much.